Our topic today is fossil and renewable energy, carbon balance, and environmental impacts. It's a pleasure having Tammy Nimet. Dr. Nimet is a UK-based strategic energy analyst. Good afternoon, Tammy Nimet.
Good afternoon. How are you today?
Fine, thank you very much. Please let me share oil and gas value chains, only a draft that contains exploration, development of production, operation of production, and some other details. But the important thing that I would like to address to you, Tammy, is the first tier providers represented by F1 and the second tier providers, F2, connect to the first tier providers, and the cross and generic providers. So this is for upstream. You have the same thing for downstream, to the retail, from the midstream to the retail. And the question that I have, please let me move here. Okay. Uh, um, Taking consideration the whole supply chain from very the beginning to the complete end, comparing fossil, in this case oil and gas, and renewables, uh, um, what are the differences for carbon balance and for environmental impacts? I know that's a very tricky question.
Oh my gosh. It's a very good question. And it's, as you say, it's complex. I think there's been some work done on what the fossil fuel supply chains are, right? So we kind of know that. But when it comes to renewables, that supply chain seems to be rather murky, or they don't wish to talk about it so much. Now, I know that there's been some amazing engineering studies done. There's been an engineering study done out of the UK back in 2019 where they wrote an open letter saying the supply chains for renewables are problematic. We need to make sure that there's enough, but there isn't enough minerals out there. We'd have to increase supplies significantly. And where are we getting those supplies from? And that creates a problem for energy security. In Holland in 2018, one of the universities was tasked with researching the supply chains just for doing wind and solar, not for batteries, not for EVs, none of that stuff. Just what would be the material supply chains necessary to do the energy transition in Holland. And their conclusion was that there's not enough. There's not enough mining going on, that what Holland would need alone for its energy transition would be more than what all of Europe currently uses from copper, all of the rare earths and cobalt and so on. And the silicon. And then Mark Mills, who has done incredible research and writing about what the supply chains for renewables are. And he looks at in particular what the physics limitations are for this type of technology, in addition to how much energy is required to get it out of the ground, to
Mhm.
process it, and then actually construct it. And he had some really fascinating statistics, which I can send you links and you can put it in the description or something. But he talks about it, if you look at where all of those metals and those supply chains are, they're controlled or dominated by China. So the European Union is pursuing their energy transition, saying that we need to reduce our dependency on hostile actors or potentially hostile actors like Russia. But in the next instance, they're increasing their dependency on a potentially hostile actor, namely China. And China has demonstrated in the past that it will use those supply chains as a weapon, which they did back in, I think it was around 2012, 2013, with respect to some rare earths that Japan needed to make electric vehicle batteries. And they were having some kind of trade dispute, and China cut off their supply. So it's not like China hasn't done this before. So what makes Europe think that they wouldn't do so in the future, particularly when there's going to be all kinds of competition if all the Western countries pursue the same policies at the same time, competing for the same resources? It's a terrible scenario for supply chains and energy security.
But tell me, what's the reason that they have this advantage for compared to the other countries? Because they have that's natural resource, or they process this material very well.
Well, so China has control of the distribution of the mining. So they will go in and their contractors will go and they'll purchase cobalt that's being mined out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, or they'll go and they'll contract for the lithium. So then it goes through their people, then it has to be processed. And then China ends up processing a fair amount of it because it's energy intensive. And European countries also have strict environmental regulations,
Yeah,
which prohibits them to some extent from processing as much as they would like. So France has a few processing facilities and more being built in, say, the United States and elsewhere.
yeah,
But China still controls, I think, somewhere in the 70% range of processing and also controls the distribution lines. Then actually the construction of the windmills and the solar panels and the batteries, they're taking place in China, and a lot of that production that has been ongoing in Europe is being shifted to China. And why? Because of the energy cost. So China, which builds new coal-fired plants every week and is planning to increase their coal electricity and energy for decades to come, they use that cheap energy, that reliable energy, in order to produce the windmills and solar panels that will make Europe and the Western world even more dependent on China.
yeah, perfect. United States and Brazil is the same case. They do not have some restrictions as Europeans have. No, that's a good point.
I think Brazil is an interesting case, and I don't know enough. You probably know more about it than I do of what the sort of environmental arrangements are
Trying to be
for that.
stronger, but it's not too strong yet.
Right. But in the United States and Canada, like Canada just released a mining strategy earlier this week or the end of last week. I haven't had a chance to take a good look at it yet, where they want to encourage all of this new mining for these critical resources. But for example, a regular oil and gas mining project takes over 10 years to go through the approval process in Canada.
My God.
Now, they're talking about perhaps expediting this for these critical minerals, but there's a lot of resistance to the type of environmental degradation that does take place when one does mining. So what they might have this strategy, but there's a whole process that it has to go through that is actually very time consuming and has to go through several different hoops, regulatory hoops.
Mhm. You mentioned something important. Uh, how can we see the entire process? And normally for renewables, we do not talk about the entire process. People do not talk, or because or by ignorance or by intentional proposals. So, what's the reason you see that we do not touch these two corners of the process for renewables: the beginning, mining, and the strong process of environmental impact, and the end, let's see, to reject the old equipment and debris and things like that.
Well, thank you so much for mentioning the disposal, that like the retirement of assets, right? Because there's a great deal of discussion about how expired wells or abandoned oil wells or natural gas facilities are retired at their end of life,
Like,
or if a company goes bankrupt or something. But there's not a similar discussion with respect to the solar panels and windmills. Now, there's
exactly.
been a few different reports coming out, I would say since July, maybe. There's a few earlier ones where they talk about the windmills are actually wearing out much quicker than they've been projected. So instead of the 20-year lifespan, they're now um, falling apart really within 7 to 9 years. That's, in half. So what do you do with it when it's done? There is no real way to recycle it because of the components, their composites, and things are all kind of together and it's very difficult to separate. So what they're doing is they're burying them. So there's these large swathes of land in, I know, in like Montana and various other places, where they're just digging big trenches and burying the windmills. What they do in Europe, I'm not sure. And with the solar panels are filled with a lot of toxic chemicals, and they're actually considered um, a toxic substance. And they 1 in 10 of European solar panels are recyclable. That's it. Or what they're actually trying to recycle. But it's not cost effective. It's extremely difficult. Is very energy intensive because you have to heat it up and melt it and try to separate all of these different things to get, to separate it out and get the different components. So what they're doing is they're burying them. So you have all of these toxic chemicals leaching out of the solar panels, going into the soil and possibly the groundwater. So, where's the argument against that with respect to biodiversity? We've
Perfect.
had the big biodiversity conferences going on in Montreal for the past 10 days or so. And, where's the argument that maybe these renewables aren't good for the environment, that there's other environmental damages and more concerns than emissions? And what about
Exactly.
all the emissions, as you say, are through the entire supply chain? The amount of energy required to mine it, to refine it, to process it, to build it, and to recycle it.
Perfect.
So there's a lot there, and
Environment.
they don't talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. Let me show Meg Montana is a very important person in Brazil. She's advisor for an oil company in Brazil. Is for an Australian company that works in Brazil. So thank you, Meg. Welcome. And but let me back to your position. What was great your analysis this analysis. But is by ignorance or by intentional proposals? Do not touch this. I know it's a tricky question for you.
Well, so it's not like there, as I've said, it's not like there hasn't been studies and serious studies, engineering and otherwise,
Yeah.
to show the problems. And yet the policymakers choose not to acknowledge them. And again, it becomes a matter of why is that? Now, they're so driven on this policy, this energy transition, that even with the Russian issue in Ukraine and the dependency and trying to reduce dependency on oil and gas, instead of stepping back and reconsidering what has happened with the lack of energy security in Europe, you have all these renewables and they still don't provide any security. They're not slowing down. In fact, they're accelerating it, and they talk about accelerating it. So why is that? And I think that's a reasonable question that people should be asking of their politicians and
Yeah,
their
that's
policymakers. Why are you doing this?
why are
And
you doing this?
why are
Knowing
you?
that this is
Yeah.
yeah, perfect. Tell me, please, if you could compare these two supply chains in terms of giving a number for the carbon emission for renewables and fossil fuels, fossil energy, how do you compare? If fossil is 10, how much would be for renewables, the carbon emission in the total supply chain? As I know that's a very tricky question again. I know.
That's a hard question. Um, so I can give you a study that was done. I think it was the UK study. And so they estimated that the energy cost for cobalt production was 7,000 to 8,000 kilowatt hours for every ton of metal produced. And for copper, it's 9,000 kilowatt hours per ton.
It was
And then
fantastic.
they factored that out. If you had 31.5 million cars in the UK and you wanted to swap it all out for electric vehicles, you would need 22.5 terawatt hours of power to produce the new metals just for the UK fleet.
My
And
God.
that amounts to 6% of the entire UK 2019 annual electrical usage.
My,
That's just to produce the batteries and like the
my.
minerals for the batteries of these cars.
Yeah,
So
but we
I
need
don't
other
have the
things that
numbers,
more than batteries. We have panels, we have
like
everything.
all of it, right? So if you start adding all those in together, it becomes this enormous number. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the numbers offhand of what the supply chain energy emissions use is for hydrocarbons, but that would be a really good comparison to make. What's the difference between the hydrocarbon emissions versus the entire supply chain of the renewables.
Exactly, exactly. Very good point to study and to deep understand. Because my perception, maybe so my perception, that we do not see the complete supply chain for renewables and for fossil energy. We see details. We are looking for everything that can happen. Of course, we have problems with fossil, with hydrocarbons. No doubts about that. We have carbon, we have environmental impacts, we have leakage. Of course, we have, but we have problems as you was mentioned with renewables equipment, especially for equipment manufacturing, materials, and so like this. Tell me, you in our last conversation, we mentioned something that's very curious for me. You mentioned that energy security must be in the left side of the equation. Please bring to us these thoughts. It's fantastic.
Well, so when they talk about environmental, social, and governance, and how they want to shift the investment away from hydrocarbons, no more fossil fuel investment, and swap it all over to renewables, particularly wind, maybe solar to some extent. I don't know about nuclear. Um, so when you have your ESG, the security should be at the front on the left side. We should be number one issue should be your security. Then you can look at what that means for your environment, social, and governance. Because without security, without energy security, your national security is at risk. And
Perfect.
so why the countries ought to be looking at what's in the national interest for economic strength, for national security strength. And ultimately, they would, if they would think about this realistically and how people expect them to, that would mean energy security. So that should be your first thing. That should be on the left side of that equation of ESG. The energy security should be first.
Mhm, mhm. And politicians are not aware about these issues yet. They are trying to understand, or they have different agendas. We don't know exactly, and we need to call them to talk to us to explain. From, Mr. Birol, Mr. Gutierrez, to talk a little bit about these issues, the complex supply chain, the energy security, because they are talking about energy transition like something very easy and very comfortable. It's not comfortable. It's complicated because we do not have enough volume of energy, renewables energy yet. We would like to have, but we do not have yet. Is it your thoughts too?
It's not even just that we don't have enough yet. We can never have enough of it for what our current lifestyle is without taking up so much land. Because if you think of also not just what the supply chains are, but what is the land footprint for the windmills and solar panels, and how much water does solar take just to keep clean? Like they're talking about this new solar farm that they want to put in, I think it's in Morocco or somewhere in North Africa, and then run cables under the Mediterranean in order to get electricity to Italy and the rest of Europe. But in wherever there's solar panels in desert environments, they have to use tons of water to keep it clean because dust blows. And when the solar cells are covered in dust, you lose efficiency, you lose power generation. So, where's the environmental concerns about that? My concern is that there isn't enough, we can never have enough renewables, but maybe the policymakers know that, because the ultimate goal for some of these people, especially the environmental groups who are in Montreal right now talking about biodiversity, it's deindustrialization, it's
Mm,
decarbonization, it's degrowth. So if you have degrowth where they're talking about, I'm sorry, you can't live the nice lifestyle we've had for the past 50 years. You're going to have to do with less, live in a smaller place, not have a car, And as Switzerland has found out, even with an electric vehicle, you're not really allowed to drive it because, it's going to be a drain on the grid. So, then that leads to that explanation that degrowth maybe is part of the ultimate goal, which is maybe why they don't want to address what the real problems and issues are. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. We need to rethink that these plans for the world, and specifically for each country, because United States is doing the same thing. It's not because we do not expect that United States had this direction that is taken today. Is a totally different. It's very close to the European manner of thoughts. Interesting, interesting.
Well, all the G7 are on the same path. They're all in the same pathway. And they're trying to pull in as much of the G20 as they can. Obviously, with Russia and China and India in the G20, there's some resistance to this pathway. But the G7 for sure, and a big chunk of the G20 are all going down this route. And if I can just remark once again about Mark Mills's study, he talks about how it's if you look at how many pounds of batteries are required just to back up a renewable grid, it's an outrageous amount, and it's 200 times costs 200 times more than what hydrocarbons is, and it takes up way more materials than what like a barrel of oil can do. If you store it and conserve it for use in vehicles or whatever. So they're like the supply chains for all of that, the cost of it, it's just it's outrageous. And I don't know how the world, the G7 or whatever, is possibly going to afford all this. And if I could just make one point, HSBC announced this week that they were going to be stopping all new investments in fossil fuels, and they included in there nuclear.
Wow.
So they will not fund any fossil fuel projects, and they will no longer fund nuclear projects. But if this is all about emissions, why would a bank not wish to fund nuclear power
Yeah,
plants?
yeah, yeah.
Why
The
would they be
numbers.
forcing only they want to promote wind energy?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Some kind of different interests, not maybe, let's see, the interest that the population have. So something strange, but we should have a serious study about this complete supply chain. Would be interesting for decisions, taking decisions for decisions, because nowadays we are touching like lost people in the world. So we need to have we incentivize you that is a very clever and strong person in this area could let's see propose to this study in your university and your area, because it's very important. We are not speaking clear things and comparable things.
You're right. And in order to make the proper decisions, you need to have all of the best information there and have proper comparisons. But what I found, at least in Canada and the UK, is that they haven't been doing proper cost benefit analyses. So they always look at what the potential costs are of emissions, but never looking at what the benefits are. Now,
Mhm.
the Canada Parliamentary Budget Office took a look at what the potential transition costs are and whatnot, and they concluded that Canada's contribution, if we went full renewable, if we stopped producing oil and gas, if we stopped doing all of this, it would have a negligible effect on global temperatures, like
Mhm.
0.08 or something like that. And they said, so it won't really have any effect at all. It's like within a rounding error. But it's really important to do it anyway because Canada can be an example. And I thought, okay, so we'll have no effect. We're going to destroy our economy. We're going to make people suffer. And people are suffering right now with the high cost of energy, the high cost of food, the high cost of everything, mortgages and inflation and all of these kinds of things for no appreciable effect. So why, if we had a proper cost benefit analysis, then at least maybe the public could think
Correct.
about it, could understand it a little bit better, and put pressure on those politicians who pretend like nothing is going to change.
Perfect. 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 Nonsense decisions and based on nonsense data. So we have two problems.
Two problems.
Two
Or
problems.
even the data that they have, it's not just that it's nonsensical, it's politically driven, politically motivated. And I can give you like so many environmental inspired studies that say how great this will all be, and very few that that are acknowledged, that point out the reality. And I think it's really important for people to understand what the energy and societal reality will be the way they're going down this path.
Perfect. Another fantastic conversation with Dr. Tammy Nimitz. She lives in Oxford and works in every part of the world. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you again today.
Thank you so much, Armando. It's always a pleasure to have these conversations with you. You're so knowledgeable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.